Well, I got to spend an eventful evening into the wee hours of the morning in an emergency room this past weekend, which was quite an experience. Just taking care of some stitches on a kid, kind of your experience that every kid has to go through at some point, right? But I was thinking as I'm sitting in the ER, my wife is there with me. The ER is just one of those places where you don't really want to look around too much because you start to see things where you're like, oh, I don't want to see that, right? And I have so much respect and admiration and thankfulness for ER nurses, for those that are serving and doing this and helping others. But if you've ever been in an ER before, it's just one of those places where sometimes you're going to see things where you just want to turn away from. Right? Because you see it and you're just like, oh, that's not a delightful sight. I don't want to look at that if I don't need to. Right? And this is what makes nurses so amazing is they voluntarily come into that for us, and we're so grateful. But I was just thinking there's so many things in life where we turn away from them because they're not pleasant to look at. They're either embarrassing, or we find them disgusting, or we just find it much better to not have to think about those things and turn towards other things. And in fact, there's actually times in the Bible where we're faced with moments like that, where we come across doctrines or stories or moments when everything in us just wants to turn away from those things and say, I'd rather not look at that because it's not pleasant to look at. And 1 Samuel chapter 15 is one of those stories where everything in us says, let's move on. I don't like this. This is unpleasant. This is uncomfortable. And there's certain doctrines that maybe we come across or truths about who God is that maybe make us feel anxious or uncomfortable. We don't know what to do with, and so we'd rather just turn away from them and not look. And this morning we come across one of those. And my heart, and I believe God's heart for us today, is not to look at this chapter and this story and turn away from it, but to actually stand our ground and steadily look it in the face. And examine it and understand it. And to see the character and nature of God and understand what He's showing us rather than to simply turn away from it. And this is one of the great benefits of walking through books of the Bible, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, is we don't get to pick and choose what we want to focus on and what we don't. It just hits us right in the face and we got to look at it. And so this morning we are going to do that today, and we're going to come back to the rest of chapter 15 next week, but I thought today it would be beneficial for us to at least pause on specifically the instruction that God gives in verse 3 to devote to destruction an entire people group, the Amalekites. Because there are many that have looked at moments like this in the Old Testament and charged God with the charge of genocide. And say, how could God be good? How could God be loving if He commands what seems to be genocide at a couple points throughout the Old Testament? And if you're familiar with it, with anyone that doesn't believe in Jesus, or this is actually a very common argument, particularly with atheistic groups or atheistic worldviews that charge God with genocide and said there's no way that even if He existed that you could follow a God like this. So we need to deal with that. We need to talk about that. In fact, one of the most prominent new atheists, Richard Dawkins, he says this. He says, what makes my jaw drop is that people today would base their lives on such an appalling role model as Yahweh, as God. And even worse, that they should try to force the same evil monster on the rest of us. And in fact, in specifically talking about some of these instructions, he says, in these moments, the killing of particularly Canaanites, we see an evil monster in which bloodthirsty massacres are carried out with xenophobic relish. In fact, one atheist describes it this way, that these instructions, these commands that God gives to devote certain people groups to destruction is, quote, morally indistinguishable from Hitler's invasion of Poland. That's not like a random group of people that think that. This is becoming more and more mainstream of a thought about the God of the Old Testament. And it's particularly why you're often seeing people say, well, yeah, the God of the Old Testament, he's angry and kind of vengeful and wrathful, but let's focus on Jesus in the New Testament. And even some of the new atheists are picking up on, hey, actually Jesus talks a lot about judgment too. We need to take the Bible as a whole, and we have to deal with some of these accusations and understand them. And I believe that we do have very good answers and hope to find from these stories. But we must be careful as followers of Jesus in looking at moments like this and stories like this and feeling this temptation like we need to protect God's reputation. We don't. You don't need to turn away from these stories and feel like just kind of cover that up and look over here at this other shiny object so that you don't see the things God did in the Old Testament. We don't need to protect God's reputation. He's written these down for everyone to see and have record of. He doesn't need your protection. He doesn't need you to just kind of hide it. He actually longs for us to understand it and know what's going on in these stories. And as we begin, I want to just give you a question to be considering as we go through this, and it's this. You don't need to answer it, but just think about it. Is God ever justified in taking life? I want you to just think about that. Is God ever justified in taking life? And if so, when? When would he be justified in doing that? Just think about that as we jump on in. Well, as we come to 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel comes to Saul with instruction from the Lord to come against these people called the Amalekites, which sometimes we read people groups in the Bible and we have no association for who they are. So I want to give us some history on the Amalekites and who these people are, and maybe helping us understand why is God calling Israel to destroy this people? Who are they? Here's what we know about the Amalekites is they're not simply just like an aggressive people determined to kind of just be a pester to Israel. These people, the Amalekites, are actually a threat to God's plan of salvation to all other nations. These people are very intent on stopping the God of Israel. In fact, we know that the Amalekites are actually descendants from Esau. If you remember the story of Jacob and Esau, who are the sons of Abraham, Isaac, right? Who's the son of Abraham, right? Who's the father of Israel, the one whom God called to start the nation of Israel. So you have Abraham's son Isaac, and Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. Right? They're twins, and there's this constant feud between Jacob and Esau. And the Lord promised Jacob's mom that he would be, the younger son Jacob would get the blessing, that he would be the one who God continues his line through, even though Esau was the firstborn. You may be familiar with the story, but basically Esau sells his birthright to his younger son Jacob and then despises him for it. And Jacob gets the blessing from his father. And so the Esau hates his brother Jacob that this happened. And the Lord chooses to use Jacob and to carry his line through Jacob. And so the descendants of Esau become haters of Israel. In fact, Jacob's name is eventually turned into Israel. He is the one who has the 12 sons, which become the 12 tribes of Israel. It's all in the book of Genesis. It's great. It's fun. But these descendants of Esau became people that despised God's covenant promise to Israel. And so the descendants of Esau became dedicated to making sure no one has access to the covenant that they rejected. Esau rejected his own birthright, lost his blessing, and so his people, his descendants, became people who were dedicated to say, well, if we can't have it, you can't either. And they're enemies of God's covenant to his people Israel. And they were determined to making sure no one else could enjoy it as well. And I just want to ask you this question. Who else does that sound like? What other enemy of God in the scriptures rejected the Lord and doesn't want anyone else to enjoy what he's offering either? It sounds like Satan, right? Who in the beginning with many angels rebelled against God, rejecting what God had, his plans, and said, I don't want to be a part of it, and became God's enemies, and in the process said, I now don't want to let anyone else enjoy the blessings that God wants to bring through Jesus. And so these people are very much an embodiment of the heart and the mission of Satan. And it tells us, we know this from the book of Exodus, that as soon as the people of Israel left Egypt, there was a group of people that attacked them right away. Who was it? The Amalekites. The very first people that attacked the people of Israel in Exodus are the Amalekites. And there's this great battle that happens. If you're familiar with the story in Exodus chapter 17, the story where every time Moses is holding up his arms, Israel is winning the battle. If he ever lets his arms down, Israel starts losing. And so he has people come around him to hold his arms up in battle so that the Lord gives them victory. It's a beautiful, awesome story. I mean, not beautiful, it's kind of bloody and gory, but it's awesome. That's against the Amalekites. And they continue to be this pest to Israel and this enemy of Israel. In fact, as they're wandering the desert, it tells us that they were picking off the stragglers in the back. That they would come off and see how they could pick off the weak ones and the struggling ones and the slow ones in the back. These people hated Israel. And so God gave this instruction in Deuteronomy chapter 25, where it says this. He says, therefore, when the Lord has given you rest from all your enemies around you, when you get into the promised land, into the land the Lord is giving you for an inheritance to possess, when that happens, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven, and you shall not forget. So the Lord told them years earlier, later, when you get into the promised land, I'm going to instruct you to wipe them out totally. These people who are killing you and coming against you and hate God's promise and hate the covenant blessing and the blessing that God wants to bring to all the nations, these people hate it and don't want anyone to have it. And in fact, if you continue in your Bible, you'll see another Amalekite show up in the book of Esther. The book of Esther is just kind of this crazy story about this group of Israelites that stayed in exile in Babylon when the rest could go back to Jerusalem, and they stayed here. And we see this great evil man named Haman, who's an advisor to King Xerxes, and he hates the people of Israel. And it tells us that he's an Agagite. And Agag is a title given to leaders of Amalekites, like the king in this story who's called King Agag. And so this guy, Haman, devotes his life to trying to destroy the people of Israel and wipe them out through genocide in the book of Esther. And so we see that these people, they're not just like, hey, go destroy your neighbor down the street, like those kind people that you know. No, these are fierce enemies of God and God's people and the mission of God to bring salvation and blessing to the nations. And as we look at stories like this or instructions like this, what rises up in us is this question of, is this just of God to do? Well, usually it's not more of a question, it's more of an accusation. This is not just of God to do. But if it's formed as a question, we say, is it just for God to do this, to command this, to instruct this, to tell his people to do this? And we're told in the scriptures that God is just. It's not really something that's open for debate or discussion. The scriptures actually tell us that this is core to God's character and his nature. He is just. It's who he is. Here's 3 verses. I'll throw them up on the screen. Genesis 18 says, shall not the judge of the earth do what is just? And the question is, or the answer is beckoned of like, well, of course, he will always do what is just. Or Romans 9, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. Or in Deuteronomy chapter 32, Moses, the rock. He says, God, the rock, his work is perfect. All his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness, without iniquity, just and upright is he. And so this is actually who God is. It's been who he's always been. He's eternal. He's always existed, never created. This is who he is. And so actually to ask the question, is God just in doing this, is actually an illegitimate question. Because it presupposes that we are just, and we are the judges, and we put God on trial according to our standard of justice. It presupposes that we know what true justice is, and therefore we can weigh God's actions against our standards. And if he doesn't measure up, he's unjust. If he does measure up, he is just. Who's the perfectly just one in that situation? Humanity. This is modern secular worldview. Okay, that humanity is the standard of justice. God, must be weighed accordingly. That's actually entirely illegitimate. God is the one who is just. And actually, he will be the one who weighs us. But I don't think that means we just ignore the question and say, well, God's just, so therefore we can't really talk about the question. No, but I think we need to change the question to say, how can this be just? If God is just and he commands something like this that seems to us to be injustice, well then, surely it has to fit with who he says that he is. So how could it be just? That's a better question. If God claims to be just, how can this action be just? I want to look at a couple things. First one is this, is that we have to recognize God is the sovereign creator over all things. God has sovereign authority over everything. He is the creator of it. No one asked to be created because no one existed. He created out of his own kindness, out of his own generosity. And it's a common thought that if God exists, well, then he shouldn't have any status higher than human beings. That's a very common perspective. Well, okay, if we can agree that God exists, well, then he shouldn't have any priority or any authority or status higher than human beings, because then that wouldn't really be fair or just to us. But if he's the creator of all things, if he's sovereign over all things, it means he has authority over those things. And when we read the scriptures, we are confronted with this truth, is that every human being deserves justice. No one deserves mercy. There is no one that has a claim to mercy. It's because it's, by definition, you can't. It's mercy. Everyone deserves the justice of God for their sins because we aren't just. Which it's crazy to think about, but it means this. At any moment, God could take someone's life as judgment for their sins and be completely justified in doing it. At any moment, God could take any person and take their life from them as judgment for their sins and it not be wrong. And everything in us says, no way. That's injustice. Because we think we are the standard of justice. We think we deserve mercy. We deserve blessing, prosperity, life. But actually, we all deserve justice. And so when we come to the Amalekites, they're not innocent people. I mean, just to look at the adults, they're spreaders of wickedness. They're evil. None of them have a right to mercy. And we're told that all of us are born sinners. All of us came forth in iniquity. No one has a rightful claim to God's mercy, no matter how young or old we might be. And so when God pronounces judgment on sin on the Amalekites, he is also simultaneously pronouncing mercy on Israel, because Israel also deserves God's judgment. And so to take out the Amalekites is also mercy to Israel. Because if God alone has the right to judge, because he's just, then only he knows what the Amalekites deserve, and only he knows what would happen if he doesn't stop them. We don't. We think we do. We don't. And so to take out these enemies, these Amalekites, is not only God's judgment on sin, but it's also mercy on Israel. Let's look at this a little bit in context in the Old Testament, because I think it might help us understand this a little bit more. Last week we read from Deuteronomy chapter 20. If you remember, last week we were talking about, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, there's some laws that God gives for how to conduct Israel's to conduct themselves in war. And what we particularly looked at last week is before they go into war, the priest is supposed to come and give an address to the people. Okay? But also in that very same chapter, God gives the people of Israel specific instructions for two types of warfare. Okay? And it's against two types of people. He gives one type of instructions for if you're fighting against cities outside the promised land, here's how you're supposed to fight against them. And here's how you're supposed to fight against cities inside the promised land. And in those instructions, the only time he will tell the people of Israel to devote to destruction, to drive people all the way out, is against the cities in the promised land. Because that God has reserved for his people. I think that's important to understand. And there's two main purposes, I believe, in God giving these instructions to devote to destruction. And the first one is this, is stopping the spread of abominable practices or stopping the spread of sin. We like to think of some of these people groups because we don't know them as sure, maybe some of them are mean, but they're probably fine. But we're told that the Canaanite people engaged in some horrifically evil things. Child sacrifice as worship to gods, brutal murder of kids, just some things that we would look at and we would all want to turn away from. And so God is stopping the spread of those practices. He doesn't want those to continue to spread. And a second purpose of it is he wants to protect his people, Israel, from that sin, from the greatest evil in the world, the spreading of sin. He wants to protect his people from that and preserve his covenant with them. And so there's two great purposes in these instructions from the Lord. One is judgment on sin. Get it out of here, put it to an end, stop it. The second one is mercy towards his people. And even in the midst of these commands to devote everyone and everything to destruction, there seems to have been room for some exceptions. And those exceptions would come when those people would choose to repent of opposing Yahweh and join the people of Israel. In fact, we see a couple instances of this in the book of Joshua. If you're familiar with Joshua chapter 2, when the people of Israel are about to go destroy the land, the city of Jericho, right? That story where they walk around the city 7 times, then they blow their trumpets and the walls come tumbling down. When they go to spy out the land, there's a prostitute named Rahab, not of the people of Israel, either ethnically or morally. And she turns to become an Israelite. She turns to follow Yahweh, follow the God of Israel. And she's grafted in, and she and her family are saved. So there seemed to be room for people to turn away towards the God of Yahweh and be the God of Israel and be brought in. And in fact, Rahab becomes the great-great-grandmother of King David and gets mentioned in the lineage of Jesus, a non-Israelite prostitute, because she turned and put her faith in Yahweh. There's also another story in the book of Joshua about a whole people group, the Gibeonites, who also turned and were not destroyed. And so there seems to be exceptions to these, to where if these people groups or people turn from opposing God to following him, well, then they aren't destroyed. That's important. Additionally, Israelites could face the same kind of destruction if they opposed Yahweh. There's another story of that also in the book of Joshua. Joshua's just loaded. Joshua chapter 7, there's a man named Achan who disobeys the Lord, goes against his commands, opposes the plans of Yahweh, and he and his family are devoted to destruction. The reason why those are significant, that there's exceptions, that those that have turned that weren't Israelites could come, not be destroyed, and be a part of God's people, and that there were Israelites too, that if they opposed Yahweh could be devoted to destruction. The reason why those are significant is because they show us this. The command to destroy was not rooted in ethnic otherness. That's what genocide is. It is the wiping out of a people group because they are a different ethnicity. They're a different people group than us. We are better and we take them out. These commands that God gives to destroy is not rooted in ethnic otherness. because even Israelites could be subject to it. And if it was otherness, then there would never be any exceptions of anyone being able to turn from their sins and come in. It's rooted in rebellion against the plans of God. That's what it's rooted in. It's rooted in sin. And so God commands Saul to destroy the Amalekites, not because they're non-Israelites, but because they oppose God and his plans. This is massively important. It's not because they're non-Israelites. It's because they oppose the plans of God and they pursue wickedness that they're going to be destroyed. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 9 tells us this. This is God telling the people of Israel that it will not be because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that I'm going to give you their land. Here's why. It's because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving them out. And so that he may confirm that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. God's saying, when I call you to destroy them and drive them out, it's not because you're so good. It's because they're so wicked and they need to get out. And I need to preserve my covenant, which is God's mercy to the nations. And in fact, these cities that God commands destruction of, they're never just neutral. They're always aggressors first. And so to call these instances, like this one here, some kind of ethnic cleansing or genocide is extremely inaccurate. It's out of place. It's not what's happening here. This is God's justice against sin and his mercy towards his people. And I mentioned that what the accusation seems to be in here is that God doesn't love ethnically others besides Israel, but actually in this moment we see God's love for all the nations in him doing this. You know, we talk about that at Gospel City. We talk about, we point to Revelation, where we see in Revelation that Jesus is assembling for himself a people from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation. That God has a heart to take the gospel to the ends of the earth, to every nation. That's not a new emphasis in the New Testament. That's rooted in God's nature and his character from the beginning. From the very beginning, God has been about bringing a blessing to the nations. It's actually the entire reason why Israel exists. Because when God calls Abraham in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 12, he says, I'm going to, through you, bring a blessing to all the nations. He doesn't just start Israel to bring a blessing to just Israel. And that's really good news for us, because if God was not about bringing the gospel to the nations, we would not know him. You and me are the nations when we look at it here. We are the Gentiles, the non-Jews that could be brought in. And so God actually seeking to wipe out the Amalekites who are against the covenant of God, against the blessing coming to all the nations, we can actually be grateful he does this because it's what preserved the covenant to come to us. This is God's heart. He loves the nations. In fact, Isaiah chapter 56, I think this is beautiful. This is God's heart for the nations. This is what he says. He says, let not the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. Let not the foreigner who joins himself to the Lord think that God's going to just view you as separate and keep you as like second class. Instead, he says this, the foreigners who joins themselves to the Lord, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the peoples. That's God's heart. And it's why if you remember the story in the Gospels where Jesus goes to the temple and he overturns all the tables because it's the money exchange is happening and all that. It's not just because those people are trying to make profits off of worship. It's also because of where they were doing it. They were doing it in the court of the Gentiles, which means, here's what they were doing. They were not allowing the nations to come and worship God. They took their place of worship and turned it into a marketplace. To basically say, if you're not Jewish, you're not welcome to come worship because you no longer have a place. We took it over. And Jesus comes in and he turns over the tables and he's furious. Why? Because his house is to be a house of prayer for all the nations. In Ephesians chapter 3, we see this, where Paul says this, that the mystery of the gospel is this, that the Gentiles, the non-Jews, the nations are fellow heirs, members of the same body, partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. God's about the nations. He loves the nations. He wants to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. Because he loves the nations, we ought to love the nations too. So we must be careful at looking at stories like this and moments like this in Scripture and thinking that our reluctance to do something like this, our reluctance to follow that kind of instruction, to destroy a whole people group, we must be careful in thinking that our reluctance to do something like that makes us more good and more holy and more loving. Because that tends to be the idea. Well, I don't want to do this. This is evil. This is scary. This is wrong. I would never do this. I'm more loving than that. When in actuality, it is precisely because God is more loving than you and me, more holy, more good, that he does do this. Here's what one person says. One theologian says this. He says, new atheists seem to resist the notion of Yahweh's rightful prerogatives over humans precisely because they seem uncomfortable with the idea of judgment in any form. Let me read that one more time. New atheists seem to resist the notion of Yahweh's rightful prerogatives over humans precisely because they seem uncomfortable with the idea of judgment in any form. Our culture is allergic to judgment. It's why maybe the most popular Bible verse now is from just random people is probably no longer John 3:16. It's probably judge not lest you too be judged, which is what Jesus says. That seems to be probably the most well-known Bible verse right now because our culture is allergic to judgment. And in all honesty, I think it's rooted in large part because if I don't judge others, they won't judge me. And I won't have to answer to anyone for my beliefs or my choices or my lifestyle. I get to be in charge. So if I proclaim the message, don't judge or you'll too be judged. It's a facade of, I'm just loving. But actually it's pride to say, I want to be able to live my life, make my choices, pursue my kind of lifestyle, love who I want, do what I want with my money, and not have to answer to anyone for it. Truth is, Jesus doesn't tell us not to judge. Even in that verse, Jesus is not saying don't judge. He's actually saying be extremely careful how you judge. Be extremely careful how you judge. Is actually what he's saying. Because in fact, Christians, we are called to wisely judge the sinful behavior of other Christians. Okay? We are called to do that. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Christians, you are called to wisely judge other Christians' behavior. You are called to that. What we're called to not judge, we see in 1 Corinthians 4, we are called to not judge the hidden motives of the heart because we can never know them. That's what we're called not to judge. And so the idea that God just says we're not supposed to judge is actually just it's inaccurate. And so the fact that we may feel like we would never want to do something like this command doesn't reveal that we're more loving and more accepting than God. It actually just reveals we don't hate sin and evil as much as God does. That's what it reveals. The fact that we would see this and that we would be disgusted by it, we would turn from it, that we'd never want to look at it, we would think God is evil for doing something like this, doesn't reveal that we're more loving and good. It just reveals that we actually don't hate sin as much as God does. Have you ever had that moment where you're driving in like one of those small neighborhoods and you don't know that there's like a bunch of one-way streets and you like accidentally turn down a one-way street the wrong way. You ever had that moment before? Right? And you run into someone and they're furious at you, and now you have to do the embarrassing move of like slowly backing all the way down the one-way street you turn down, right? We used to live in a neighborhood that was constant one-way streets, and it was constantly this. I was always nervous I was going to turn down the wrong street. But if you've ever had that experience, you come to understand like the direction you're moving matters in those moments. Because this street, things are supposed to flow one way. So if I flow the opposite, that is a problem. That matters. I'm not supposed to do that. And it's when we come to situations like this and this story, the directions matter. We should be shocked at these stories. We should be, but we should be shocked in the right direction. Not going down a one-way street in the wrong direction. We should be shocked at the sin and the evil. That's what we should be shocked at in these stories. And maybe even shocked that God waited so long to bring his judgment. And in this story, we'll close up with this. In this story, what we see ultimately is a picture of the final judgment. We see a picture of what is to come. Show me the person that despises God for this destruction, and I'll show you that that same person also denies that God's bringing judgment against sin at the end. Because here's what's happened in this story. God has delayed judgment on the Amalekites for hundreds of years. He has been delaying and delaying and delaying judgment on the Amalekites for years and years and years. And then in this moment, he brings swift judgment on them. God has been long-suffering with them for hundreds of years. In fact, God told Abraham, before Israel was a thing, he said, your descendants are going to be enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years, 400 years. And part of the reason for that is because the sin of the nations in the promised land is building and building and building, and their iniquity is not yet full. It is not yet complete. He literally tells Abraham that their iniquity is not yet complete, which means God is waiting and waiting and waiting. He is long suffering. He is delaying his judgment. And everything that God gives above what we deserve is grace. And so the fact that God still hasn't brought swift judgment on the Amalekites has been his mercy. They could have turned. They knew who the people of God were. They were descendants of Esau. They've rejected the covenant. And now in this moment, God brings swift judgment. And it comes swift and not quite in full, but we'll get to that next week. There's one theologian named Meredith Kline who says this, that these moments are, he calls intrusions of the eschatological judgment. Eschatological means end times, okay? It's that these moments are intrusions of the final judgment. That what God is doing here is we see these judgment events break into history at certain times as precursors of the final judgment on sin to come. Because this is what God is doing now. He is delaying his judgment. He is delaying his judgment. He is not bringing his swift judgment right now in this very moment. He is delaying and waiting and waiting, and he's long-suffering. But soon, when Christ returns, he will bring his judgment in swift and in full against sin. But right now, he's being long-suffering, and it's his mercy. It's his mercy. Look at with me at 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3 says this. Scoffers will come in the last day with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is this promise of his coming? Does this sound familiar? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. They deliberately overlook this fact that the heavens existed long ago, that the earth was formed out of water and through water by the very words of God, and that by means of these the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. But don't overlook this one fact, beloved. that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but he is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. And then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. 2 Peter tells us God is waiting. And it is his mercy and his kindness and his patience that he has not yet come to return with judgment, because he longs that more and more would turn and come to repentance. But a day is coming when Christ will return, and it will be like a thief, which means he will come with quickness and suddenness, and it will be swift and in full, and his judgment will come against sin. But right now, he's waiting, and it's his mercy. And it's meant to wake us up to the seriousness of sin and judgment, that this is coming. This is not a fairy tale. It's not a fantasy. It's coming. And it beckons us to hope in the gospel, to hope in Jesus Christ, who took on the full force of God's judgment himself, which is unbelievable. When you look at these stories, and you see the wickedness of these people, and then you see that Jesus, the perfect, holy Son of God, would step in to receive the full force of God's judgment. Are you kidding? The one who only deserves perfect love and affection from God steps in to receive his judgment. The force with which God would pour out his wrath on people like the Amalekites, he does to his own son. Where Jesus comes and he takes this ban, he takes this curse, he takes this destruction for us, for all who would believe. That is the hope, that is the good news, is that we would see this and not turn and think, oh, what a mean God, but actually see, oh my gosh, this is what's coming. Let me turn and find covering and safety and forgiveness and mercy in the person and work of Christ, who took the judgment in my place for those who would believe. See, friends, we cannot turn away from these stories, because these stories point us to the very message of the gospel. That God is just and we are not. That there is judgment coming for our sins, but for those who would turn, God can also be the justifier of us and forgive us. And through us, bring the gospel to the nations, to more and more that need to hear it and need to know it, and find covering from the judgment coming for their sins. Friends, we cannot turn from these stories. We cannot run away from God's judgment on sin. We need to look at it in the face. And yes, it is horrific. And it should stir in us a longing to hope in Christ and a longing for others to know Christ as well. And to take the gospel to the nations, which are not just across the globe, but also on our streets. Let's pray together and ask that he make us a people like that. Lord Jesus, I thank you that in this story, we are sobered up. We are reminded of the judgment that is to come, and yet we are also reminded, Lord, that you broke in and brought us mercy. That Jesus, you stepped into time, into existence, taking on human flesh, that you might take away the judgment coming for us, so that now for all of us who believe in you, all we look forward and ahead to is blessing because of you. That even now in these moments when we talk about the gospel, when we put our hope in the gospel, eternal blessings break into real time. Eternal blessings intrude into our hearts and our lives right now, that they're not just for the future, but we get to taste them and feel them and know them now. Lord, we are not deserving of your forgiveness, of your covering, of your mercy. It is simply because you have been kind to us. And so, Lord, would you make us a people, a body that's in no way afraid to talk about these hard stories. It's because in these hard stories we also see your mercy. God, forgive us for not having a heart for the nations like you do, for caring more about our own comfort, that we care more about us being temporarily comfortable than our neighbors being eternally under your judgment. Oh God, forgive us for that, because that's not your heart. We're called to reflect your heart, and when we look at things that way, we don't. Would you soften our hearts? Would you give us compassion towards those that don't know you? Not judgment on them, but compassion and mercy to bring the gospel to them. And so God, we stand here today only by your mercy. Let us never forget that. We worship you for your mercy and your grace towards us. We worship you for the God that you are, that you would take our judgment for us, willingly and joyfully. Give us right now in this very moment just a glimpse of the weight of your glory and your goodness. Pray this in Jesus' name, amen.